Okay, hi everybody. Such a pleasure to see you all here today. And I know I'm not able to see a lot of people on camera, but that means I'm seeing your soul through your name. So, speaking of soulful, our guest today is somebody that I have absolutely adored for a really long time. I don't know, 20 years, something like that. Our paths have crossed, and he is Saurabh Dalal, and he is a member of probably the most Ahimsa based faith community on earth. We'll ask and see if he agrees with that. As a Jain, he is also an engineering consultant and physicist who's passionate about promoting a vegan lifestyle and a lifelong vegetarian, vegan since 1991. Saurabh is a board member of all kinds of organizations doing good in the world, and he is a volunteer for others and an avid ethical investor. Welcome, Saurabh Dalal.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you for having me. And yeah, great to be a part of this.
Well, it's wonderful to have you. You are our second Jane. We did have Dr. Tushar Mehta a year or so ago. And if anybody likes to go in the website or our YouTube channel and look in archives for things that you weren't part of because you didn't know about us then, we invite you to do that. So, Saurabh, the thing that I want to start with is kind of picking up on something that Sarah mentioned in her sermonish when she said that very often we think of nature and technology as being opposed. And very often, too, we think of science and scientists as opposed to religious traditions. But you are a scientist and you are a Jain. So tell us how that works.
Well, I don't think there's conflict, and I think being rooted in the principles of Jainism has helped me at least. And so, I mean, I find it fascinating. I find it challenging to be involved in, various parts of work that I do. But I think the backdrop that I was raised with, thanks to my parents and the community, kind of puts things in perspective. So I think we can pursue, you know, um, kind of understanding the universe, understanding various things better, as long as we kind of have the right, framework to put it in perspective.
Cool. Well, you seem to put a lot of things in beautiful perspective. You have such a lovely way of being able to be a spiritual person in the material world, and it just seems to be seamless for you. I know that you're a great entertainer and you put together wonderful social events for people. So we mentioned before that word ahimsa, and I think probably just about everybody here knows that word, but for those who don't, I invite you to explain it and also about the role that it plays in the Jain tradition.
Sure. Okay. Well, ahimsa is loosely translated as non-injury or non-violence, and in the Jain philosophy, it is the first and foremost of the five principles of Jainism. And so it is supposed to be practiced in our thoughts, in our words, and in our actions. And so it really does kind of, it's permeates every aspect of our life. And so ahimsa is kind of the basis of how we are supposed to interact in the world. And along with the other, four principles, which I'll just mention briefly, satya, which is seeking and speaking and living the truth, and astheya, which is taking only what's given to us, aparigraha, which is detachment from material things, and brahmacharya, which is purity of mind and body. And so these five principles, we call them the Panch Prats, they represent sort of the core of Jain philosophy, and ahimsa, of course, being very relevant to those of us who are involved in, say, the animal rights movement and the vegan movement, because it does, every living being is accorded respect, and it's based on that principle of ahimsa.
So those tenets that you listed for the people here who are yogis, they will recognize those as among the tenets of yoga as well. So take us back a little bit historically and help us understand where these ahimsa faiths, and I think we think of them as Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, with probably Jainism leaning a bit more towards ahimsa than the others, again, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. So where did these principles come from? And how did they divide up? Where did Jainism come as its own particular path?
Sure. Again, I'm not a scholar, but I have read a lot about this, and it is something that's of great interest to me. So I would say that, historically, around the 6th century BCE was when we have historical figures like, say, the Buddha, Mahavira, who's kind of historically one of the significant, and the 24th of these Tirthankaras, these spiritual guides. And I think it was a time of like, a lot of religious uh, ferment. And a lot of things were happening, and there were, say, animal sacrifices, there was subjugation of women, just, disregard for the planet, not unlike, sadly, what we have going on today. And I think Jainism and other religions like Buddhism arose as a reaction to a lot of the practices of the time. And so I think they gained a lot of strong followers. If I read correctly, if I remember right, I think there was 3 to 1 uh, female to male followers of the Mahavira, and
Wow.
so back in the day, and so I think it really drew a lot of attention because of what was going on, and people feeling like there has to be a better way.
Now, that female to male thing is just too good to not follow up on because probably everybody here thought when you said that, wow, that's just like in the vegan world or in a lot of religious contexts throughout the world as well. So, as you look out into the world and all of your involvement in animal rights and vegan organizations, are you kind of lonely as a guy? You kind of one of not too many?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm feeling alone in that sense. I think we have a lot of great people involved, and it's good to see that we do have a lot of female leaders and organizations. And so I wouldn't say I feel alone, and I feel privileged to be a part of it and to work with a lot of great people.
Well, and I'm so glad that you did bring up Mahavira because my favorite quote in all the world is his to every creature, their own life is very dear. And I had heard that for years, but it really spoke to me one day when a large and to my sensibilities scary water bug was in a trash can in my second New York apartment. And that quotation just did it for me. That regardless of my aesthetics, regardless of my history, regardless of what I had been schooled to think about a creature who looked like that, to him or her, their life was very dear. And that's my answer today to anybody about why are you a vegan? Why do you do this stuff?
Yeah, no, that's true. And I would say that, the Jain religion being Ahimsa and these other principles, every living being has a soul, and each soul deserves respect and is entitled to live for its own purposes. And so, what is it that we can do to help support not only ourselves on this journey, but all other living beings? And um, the framework of these 5 principles offers people, kind of this guideline of how we can act in the world, and it being more in line with the principles, which of course means being more compassionate, more respectful, nonviolent, and really appreciating, this ecosystem, this world that we live in, and supporting it is important. So I feel like for me, these principles have helped me kind of put things in context. And whenever I have like a dilemma or a decision that I have to make, sometimes I'll look at these principles as a guiding framework to say, what should I do? What's most in line? And kind of put things in that perspective.
So, someone wrote to me when they found out that you were going to be our guest and asked if I would ask you about Jainism and karma. And they said that they think Jainism has karma more delineated than anybody else, but they don't really understand it. So, can you, and I know you said you're not a scholar, but you're Saurabh. So, can you pontificate a bit on that, please?
I will give you my view. So,
Okay.
the theory of karma is very important in Jainism, and so it's the basic idea that what you do really comes back to affecting your state, your karmic state. And so everything you do, whether it's in thoughts and words or in actions, actually does come back to you. And so your future is kind of determined by the things you've done in the past and what you do today. and what you will do in the future. So it's very deterministic in that sense that, you know, everything is in your control, and what happens to you is determined by what it is that you do. So thoughts, words, and deed. And karma plays a role because all living beings have a soul, and each soul is affected by those actions. And karma is, at least from a kind of a technical point of view, it's imperceivable to the senses, but it's something that cannot be detected. And it's what binds the soul to embodied form in the universe. And the goal of Jainism is to kind of progress on this path towards spiritual enlightenment, where you remove all the karma from your body by doing penances, by doing various deeds that help exhaust that karma to get to a state where you're eventually, over countless lives, to reach this state of moksha, which is pure energy, pure bliss, and it's an eternal state. And so by, again, practicing these principles that, are, good for yourself and for the world, you can make progress towards that path towards moksha, or we also call it nirvana. So karma plays a fundamental role, and it's what determines the cycle of birth and rebirth. That's samsara.
And I read somewhere that in the Jain view, if you're not going to devote your whole life to being a religious or spiritual person, the best thing you can do with your karma is to be vegetarian. Is that true, or was that somebody's opinion?
Well, I mean, I would agree with that. And at least from the Jain perspective, in terms of the principles, if you look at the principles and you apply them fully, I mean, really every one of those five principles points to why people should be vegan and why we should eliminate all animal products, and that exploitation and abuse and killing from our lives. And so I think it is very important for people to choose to be vegetarian and more so vegan. And I would say that all the principles, according to Jainism, really point that way. But sadly, I think a lot of people don't practice it because they still live in that world where they feel that, animals, um, you know, the treatment of animals isn't as bad as it actually is. And they kind of live in like the past. And so they kind of feel like, it's, oh, they're treated pretty well and all that. But now when you look at the reality, you understand that it's not like that at all. It's horrific. And we really have to change what we do. So sadly, many Jains are still active vegetarian. And we're seeing this great trend of more and more Jains becoming vegan because they sort of understand that this is what goes on and it is in line with the principles.
So I'm fascinated when you talk about that this cruelty-free, or as close as we can get to a cruelty-free way of life, uses all these principles, because for so many years I thought, okay, we want to do this, we want to do ahimsa. But after reading Sharon Gannon's Yoga and Veganism, she took us through all these principles and what this lifestyle choice has to do with honesty and purity in the others. So, can you do that for us too, beyond ahimsa? What do these choices that we make every day have to do with the other tenets that you talked about?
Sure. I think this is something that, we're kind of promoting more and more within the Jain community and outside. And so ahimsa is kind of, very clear how that fits in. But I'll give you an example of the principle of brahmacharya. And brahmacharya oftentimes is thought about as being, say, um, celibacy or abstinence. But when you put it in this idea of what we think, what we say, what we do, and then also what it is that we do that's also done for us and that we implicitly support. We call it karyu, karavyu, and anumodan. What we do, what's done for us, and kind of what we implicitly support. And looking at brahmacharya, what happens to animals today, right? We violate them. We violate their reproductivity. We artificially impregnate them. We force them. And this is a complete violation of even that principle of brahmacharya, because it's not only what we do, it's what's done for us, and by supporting it implicitly. And I find that when I, given talks about this, a lot of people, especially women, it sort of resonates with them. They say, that is exactly right. And our principles have already said this. We just haven't kind of recognized it that way. So that's an example of how yet another principle that's not normally connected really is vital in our understanding and should help us, appreciate how important the principles are and how much they play a role in our lives and how they lead us to something like choosing veganism.
Hmm. So just to be clear, for anybody that's like, oh my gosh, you're not saying I have to be celibate, can you talk about a little bit brahmacharya for regular people?
Well, again, it's what we do, it's what's done for us, and it's what we support, and it's thoughts and words and deeds. And so, any aspect of that, if you're in a committed relationship, then I think that's important to stay committed, to be faithful. And really, it's the focusing of your energy. And so, it's about focusing your energy on what's really important. And and so I think that's kind of the emphasis of brahmacharya. How do you focus yourself and your energy to the things that are the best for you and for the world around you?
Oh, that is so beautifully put. So some people have picked up Jain cookbooks here and there and noticed that Jains, and I don't know if this is true for you over here in America or not, you can share if it is or not, don't eat a lot of things that we think of as plant foods. So root vegetables, mushrooms, some other things Jains avoid. Tell us what those foods are and why.
Okay, so James, again, there's a practice and then there's sort of the philosophy. And if you look at the principles, it kind of leads you towards what should be least harmful. It's a minimization of harm. And what is it that we can do to survive and to help ourselves and those around us and the world around us with the minimization of harm. And so, really, it's those one sensed organisms that is least harmful to consume, and those would be from the plant kingdom. Now, root vegetables are interesting. A lot of Jains, and I'm we used to not eat root vegetables at home, but I would eat them when I go out. And the idea behind it is, and again, I practice Jainism in an imperfect way. And just like I do with anything, it is imperfect, but I try in ways that I think are, the most possible and realistic for me. Root vegetables, the reason why they say that there's more harm in eating a root is because you're actually killing the whole plant or good for the plant. Whereas if you take, say, an apple from a tree or a tomato off the vine, the plant still survives. So the amount of harm is much less when you eat something that grows above ground and not as a root because you're not killing the whole plant. So you're minimizing your harm if you don't consume a root. Then there's also the idea that there's microorganisms and other, living creatures around the soil. And if you keep on removing it and disturbing the soil, you're exposing them to sunlight and you're doing more harm to those that are around it. And so that's why they say it's better to eat, say something that's not a root. Mushrooms is an interesting one because it's really not a plant. It's not from the plant kingdom. It's certainly not an animal. And so I think a lot of Jains, kind of try and focus on only plants and those that are above ground. And also there's this idea that fungi are you know grown in environments that are not as clean and all of that. So I think a lot of Jains and myself also, I don't eat mushrooms. I don't enjoy eating mushrooms, but it's not so much an ethical thing as much as like it's just not my traditional upbringing and culturally. Even though we know that mushrooms offer some great alternatives to animal products. Um, so I think it still goes back to this idea of what is the principle of least harm, and how do you do the least amount of harm, and because food is something that's controllable, that we can choose what we put in our mouths, that it offers us an opportunity to practice it to a greater extent.
Do you find that Jain people in general have a greater sensitivity to other than human beings? Or is it just something like, I'm born into this, I practice it, and don't give it a lot of thought?
I would say that a lot of them do grow up, if they've grown up with in a Jain family or a Jain household, that they do believe that animals have a right to live, insects included. All living beings really do. So I think there is some understanding if you've grown up in a more traditional Jain household. Certainly with me when I was growing up, that was something that was very important. We would never kill insects or bugs. We would always try and scoop them up and then take them outside. And so those are the types of things I think a lot of Jains do grow up with that. So I think that there is this understanding realization. Sometimes we just live in a world that's not the world that is as it is today. And so a lot of people from our, say, the older generation, still kind of feel like, oh, animals are treated fine. And so we don't harm them by taking their milk, but they're just not really acknowledging the reality that is today. And I think the younger generation really do question things. They're seeing that, and they're seeing, like, all of these crises that we have in the world, and how these principles can offer us, good solutions. And again, being vegan is one important one of those.
So tell us about your life, Saurabh. I know you're really involved in lots of organizations. You live in two different cities. You're all over everywhere. You're such a Renaissance guy. And how does your regular daily life out there in the world reflect your Ahimsa proclivities?
Yeah. I think it's about our nature, and everyone has a certain type of nature. And I think who I am and what's important to me, I'm just trying to figure out what's the best way to do that. And of course, I'm a part of the world. I like being a part of the world, and I like learning. I like doing things. And so for me, it's that balance of trying to figure out, how do I make a living, but how do I still do what's important, and being a part of the world where you know how can I do good in the things that I do. And so even in work, I work for the city of New York, and I work on the 911 system, kind of the next generation, but I meet a lot of people who I wouldn't come across in other in other parts of my life. And even there, I think there's this understanding that, oh, well, Sarab's vegan. And if we go out or we do something, or we have, a celebration, you have to accommodate. And then it kind of creates this opportunity to have a dialogue. And people will ask all the time. And so it's another way. And, if we have people in every discipline, in every field, in every part of life, we have this opportunity to engage and to discuss. And for me, I enjoy that. I enjoy that a lot. And so, whether it's work related or some fun activities, or obviously there's activism and other things, it's just ways to kind of practice what's really important, our values that are important, and what do we do, and how do we, kind of promote those and advance those. So it's a passion, just like a lot of us on this call here. And I think in every aspect of our life, we can find a way to advance it.
Oh, that's so cool. And you do it brilliantly, especially when you're throwing a party. So there are some questions over here in the chat for our last few minutes. And Eris is asking, how would one manage those who do cause harm or do violence, whether people or animals?
Well, that is a great question, and I'll give you, I guess, my perspective is, I think in some ways, as emotional and as grave as it is, I think we have to understand that people have not always come to this in the same way that we have. And so, how do we raise awareness without making people feel defensive? And so, part of it is just having this kind of a conversation as rational as possible, and kind of questioning something. I'll give you an example of something that happened the other day. Um, I was in line at Van Leeuwen's, which has great vegan ice cream, obviously, if those of you know, in New York City. And there was a guy who looked up and saw a vegan section of the menu, and he was criticizing. He was like, "Oh, those vegans, and you know what? I would never eat that. It's got to be awful." He was kind of, an older guy, and kind of walking down the line, getting towards the back of the line. And I just kind of said to him, I said, "Oh, have you ever tried it? It tastes amazing." And I bet you, if you didn't know and you did a blind taste test, you wouldn't know the difference. And he kind of paused, looked at me, and he walked away. And then he came back and said, "You know what? I tried almond milk recently, and it was actually pretty good." And so it's just like one of those things where, who knows how it works, right? And we're not going to be able to change everyone instantaneously. But all these little things that we do add up. And when it happens multiple times, time and again, I think all of this is part of that process of change. So I think we just have to be good, positive examples. And we have to kind of understand that, look, we weren't always in the same place. They're not. Maybe they haven't had the benefits that we've had in order to understand this, and that there is potential for change. And we can be a part of that. And not being angry, but really trying to maybe ask some very good, thoughtful questions is one way, at least that I found to be pretty good. And I mean, I know people can have anger and feel very emotional about it, and those are all important too. But for me,
Yeah.
I find that kind of this thoughtful approach, and really being, sometimes we're shy about doing things, but sometimes speaking up. but doing it in a way that doesn't make them feel defensive. I think it does work. And I think these things add up over time.
Cool. Now we have 2 minutes left. So this is a theology question that gets answered in a short amount of time. Elaine is asking, in Hinduism, one either has to be born into it or brought in by a guru. I am very, very drawn to Jainism. Could I convert and become a Jain?
Well, the way we look at it is that anyone can become a Jain, and many people are Jain. It's just there's no like conversion process. But I think there are communities in major cities around the country, and then there's online resources. And so really anyone can quote unquote become Jain. And I think part of it is that if you want to be a part of a community, I think you just have to kind of find that and reach out. And there's great resources, again, online and in print and all that. So no conversion process that I know of, but I think everyone can become Jain and learn a lot from it and also contribute to the community. So I don't have a clear answer, but Elaine and anyone else, I would say if you want, please reach out to me and I'm happy to help with resources and contacts. And I think they're looking for people to bring in a lot of ideas and share their experiences so the community grows as well.
Wonderful. Well, Saurabh, thank you so much. There's one more question that we don't have time for. Hopefully, you can stay for the breakout rooms, and perhaps you'll be in the same room as the person who is asking about onions and garlic and spices. So
Sure.
maybe that's a topic for breakout rooms, onion and garlic and spices. Sounds like an Indian Italian celebration for St. Patrick's Day. Thanks, everybody. Correct.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers once again.
All the best, Saurabh.
You too.